Before lunch, when we collectively went through the exercise looking at the situation with Carl and Bill and Rebecca, it actually was a true story of what Julie Craven had to endure, and Carl was actually Jared, who was killed in March 2006, and this, what you see on the screen is a picture of Jared. Julie's son Jared was murdered by her ex-husband during a court-ordered, unsupervised visit in March of 2006. Hours after he fatally stabbed Jared, he was shot dead by police as he held a knife to Julie's throat. A law was passed shortly after his death that requires a coroner's inquest whenever a child dies during a court-ordered parental visit. Julie, as you can see from the slide, is actually the co-founder of Jared's Place, place of legal advocacy resource center for women named after Jared. It provides assistance for women who've experienced violence in a number of ways, including information, referrals, and support as they navigate through the complicated legal systems, family, criminal court, immigration, child welfare. And you have the sense, certainly from reviewing the case, the complexity of trying to deal with different, both family court and criminal court. And the Jared's Place is dedicated towards systemic and policy change through research and advocacy. Julie Craven won an award last year. She was honored by the Attorney General for not only being a survivor and a victim of horrific violence, but also by taking her pain and struggles and working to advocate for other victims. And she was recognized by the Attorney General last year for her dedicated work in this area. What Julie went through was the focus of a coroner's inquest, and you have in your package the inquest recommendations that were directed to all the ministries, many of the ministries represented here today, and many of the recommendations are yet to be fully enacted. Some are underway, but again, they're good recommendations to bring back to your agencies just to remind you of the mandate that you have that flows out of some of these horrible tragedies. I'd ask Julie to present today to us, to really give us her perspective of what it's like being somebody who's trying to navigate a very complex system and try to make sense of it, and some of the ignorance that she faced in terms of attitudes around domestic violence. So with no further ado, I give you to Julie Craven. Julie, welcome to London.
Hello, everybody. I would like to thank Dr. Peter Jaffe for inviting me to speak today. I know that there are many professionals in a diverse range of fields here. A good number of you here are very knowledgeable in the areas of domestic violence, and many others here want to learn more about ways to prevent risks to women and their children. Well, I stand here today as a victim of abuse, but more tragically, as a mother of a beloved, beautiful boy named Jared, who was brutally murdered by my abuser, who was my estranged husband and Jared's father. My little boy, who was only 8, was stabbed in his throat and his heart so violently on March 18, 2006, that the blade from the knife Andrew Ozadash used to extinguish Jared's life snapped from the handle and was found when it dropped from under his leg when paramedics lifted my boy from the landing at the townhouse his father shared with his live-in girlfriend. Jared was murdered while on a court-ordered unsupervised access weekend with his father, a violent man convicted of assaulting his wife and breaking his probation. My precious child had 11 defensive wounds on his little hands, and I know he fought desperately for his life. Yet before he was stabbed by his father, he stepped in to save his father's girlfriend and her 8-year-old daughter, who were first attacked that horrible night. Because of my son's bravery and love, this woman and her daughter escaped from the murderous rampage of Andrew Ozadash. But no child should have to be a hero. Not my child, nobody's child. My son's killer left our child bleeding to death, and fled to my home, which I shared with my Jared just 2 kilometers away. He burst through my door and attacked me in the dark. He had a 12-inch bladed butcher knife in his hand, and he was drenched in blood, my son's blood. I was held at knife point for almost an hour before I was rescued by 2 police officers who shot this man dead as he was about to cut my throat. I owe my life to these officers. Yet unlike most people who have come so close to death and survived, I don't feel lucky and happy to be alive. It has been 5 years and 7 months since that horrific night, and I grieve for my boy every day. I know my son's final words. How? His father, his killer, told me that night. They were, "Please don't kill me, Daddy." I am constantly holding in a silent scream, images of my son's violent end flashing through my mind without warning almost every day. It is unbearable to lose a child, but to lose a child to murder is soul-destroying. I have survivor's guilt. Why was I saved when Jared lost his life? What could I have done to prevent this? Even to this day, I'm still trying to figure out a way to bring him back. If only, if only, if only. I thought Jared was my present and my future, but now he will always be my past. I am heartbroken, and my mind tells me that he is never coming back. He would have started grade 9 last month, but because a violent, controlling, emotionally unstable spouse was given unsupervised access with a defenseless child, Jared never got to finish grade 3. He was such a happy boy, always singing, writing his own songs, and his favorite band was Rush. Jared was the most fascinating person I had ever met, and he was just magical. From the moment he was born, I knew I was the luckiest woman on this planet because I was his mummy. Jared was not the first child to be killed by his mother's abuser, and sadly, he won't be the last. Yet I know since his death that other lives have been saved because of greater awareness of children at risk by domestic violence and by agencies like Jared's Place in Hamilton and Luke's Place in Oshawa, which provide legal advocates and support for women and children dealing with partner abuse, and they help women navigate the maze of family and criminal court systems. Every community deserves funding for legal advocates who are aware of the dynamics of domestic violence excuse me, and the risk factors to victims and their children. Here's my path with services. As you can see, this is what an abused woman has to go through. She's never been in the court system, has no idea there's even a family court and a criminal court. So as you can see, my path after my husband's vicious assault on me on April 23rd, 2002, when Jared had just turned 5, became a jumbled maze of meeting with various agencies and family and criminal court, when, like most women, I'd never been involved with the legal system before. After midnight on April 23rd, 2002, my husband picked me up from behind and, while holding me horizontally, started bashing my head into his locked office door like a battering ram until my head burst the door open. And he continued to beat me around my head with closed fists, then flung me around like a crazed animal, throwing me against metal filing cabinets and walls, and then throwing me back through the doorway into the rec room, where my body smashed into a coffee table and landed face down. He then turned me over, and while straddling my body, he proceeded to grab my hair around the back of my head and pounded it into the carpeted but concrete floor. His large hands grasped my throat, and now realizing that he was going to kill me, I screamed out, "You're killing me!" He immediately stopped growling, and his face transformed before me into a mask of calm, where just seconds before it had been the face of madness and a rabid dog. At first he wouldn't let me up the stairs, but kept asking if I was going to the hospital, but I refused to speak to him. I had been assaulted before by this man, but this was the first time I had been so viciously beaten by him. He had been a controlling, paranoid, emotionally unstable partner who bullied me with his cruelness and his enjoyment of seeing me upset. He controlled all the finances, and all his mail went to his mother's address. I was never allowed in his home office, even when he was in it, and I was not allowed to drive his car or given a key to the shed. I think Dr. Jaffe had mentioned some of the threats, and they were If you ever leave me, it'll be war. If you think I'm an asshole now, just watch if you leave me. You'll never get custody of Jared. I ended up calling my father that night, who arrived minutes later. When my father arrived, my husband was videotaping him, trying to goad him into confrontation. I called my dad because I was terrified of what my husband would do if I called the police. Jared was still sleeping, and I was fearful for his safety. Well, I ended up calling the police that night to report the assault, and also an ambulance for my father, excuse me, as he has angina, and he seemed to be suffering from a heart attack. One officer went downstairs and spoke with my husband, while a constable talked to me upstairs in the kitchen. I was in shock, and my dad was taken to hospital, and I was afraid Jared would wake up and see the police. So I did not go into extreme detail of my assault, and the constable took notes and had me sign it, which was described as my own statements. Victims should be given the chance to be interviewed later, when they feel safer and when the shock has worn off, so the police and later the Crown get all the important facts, not just a few statements written by the police. My husband was arrested around 3 a.m. and I was never advised to go to the hospital. When I asked about attending the hospital, an officer told me, well, I could visit the police station later to have my injuries photographed. This is another mistake. Every victim should go to the hospital and have a statement taken by a doctor and then have hospital staff take photographs. I felt very uncomfortable at the station the next day, where a male and a female officer were to take my pictures. So I didn't completely disrobe, but wore a lab coat. So in the police photos, all you see is my face, neck, arms, and lower legs. You can tell I was beaten, but the numerous injuries to my torso, front and back, and thighs are not seen. After he had been arrested around 5 a.m., my sister had arrived back from the hospital where my dad had stayed overnight, and she accompanied me now into the open office. I went through papers and found that his mother was the beneficiary to all his finances. It was like I didn't even exist. It was like Jared didn't even exist. My sister discovered a wiretapping device under one of his desks. It was hooked up to the home phone upstairs. There are about 40 empty mini cases strewn around, and I found about 10 actual tapes. He had been secretly taping every incoming and outgoing call to the home. It must have been going on for years. I felt so violated. He was let out that very morning with bail and ordered not to be within 500 feet of me or my child. I was called by Victim Services to notify me that he was out on bail, and I told the woman that he had owned a gun and had shown it to me before we were married. She called me later to tell me that the gun was an air rifle, and Andy said it was in the shed. The gun I spoke of was a handgun, yet she took his word over mine. So, terrified that he or someone from his family would break into the house, I had the locks changed later that day. I later went to Victim Services, where volunteers consoled me while I told my story. I didn't realize they were volunteers and naively thought that these people would speak on my behalf. I was very naive. I had been afraid to leave my husband, but now I believe that after the assault, the police and the Crown and family court would make sure my son and I would be safe. How wrong I was. The list given to me by Victim Services of legal aid lawyers was inaccurate, as 3/4 of the lawyers listed told me they didn't handle legal aid cases. Racing the clock, I took the first lawyer who stated he accepted legal aid. Legal aid is not free. It cost me $5,000 for 1 year and a lien on the home, despite having less than $400 to my name. I had to borrow money from my father. From the first time I met with this lawyer, I was clear in describing my fear for my own safety, but more importantly, the safety of my only child. He had me sign an affidavit, but waited 3 days to enter it into court. Of course, my husband, with all his money, hired a very well-renowned lawyer in Brantford, and I became the defendant, and he the plaintiff. When I read his affidavit, when it was served to me, I could not believe what he was alleging. He denied any assault. I had had him falsely arrested, and he had been the primary caregiver since Jared's birth. According to him, I had no input with Jared and was not his caregiver. I had been a stay-at-home mother since Jared had been born. I had breastfed my child for 1 whole year. I had never spent more than a couple of hours from him at a time. I had been with my son 24/7 throughout his 5 years of life and was responsible for all his needs. My husband had been very distant with Jared, of course unless he had an audience, and had never been responsible for his care. Of course, his lawyer told these lies in family court just 3 weeks after my assault. The judge, despite reading my affidavit, where I am pleading for my son's safety and describing how dangerous his father is, asked no questions about the long history of abuse or even his arrest. I was granted interim custody, yet this violent man was granted generous, unsupervised access every weekend. Exchanges would take place at the Access Center in Brantford. I begged my lawyer to appeal, and he told me he would contact the Office of the Children's Lawyer. A year and a half later, I found out from his secretary that the forms I had filled out for the children's lawyer had still not been sent. I immediately tried to change lawyers, but was told by legal aid I did not have sufficient reason, despite my lawyer's incompetence. So I found a lawyer privately and found that the hourly cost was not that much more than legal aid. $5,000 in legal aid had gotten me 1 day in family court where a judge had signed my son's death warrant, and numerous meetings with a lawyer that went nowhere. My path with criminal court. It took only 3 weeks after the assault for the first and only day in family court, yet it took almost 9 months before my abuser was convicted in criminal court. Beside his charge of common assault, which should have been assault with a weapon, considering how my head had been used as a battering ram, he had also been charged with interception of private communication, which dealt with the wiretapping of the home phone. Ironically, this charge is more serious, and if convicted, he could have been served with a jail sentence, as interfering with Bell Canada's systems is looked upon more harshly than spousal assault by the criminal courts. When this day finally came, I was expecting a trial, but the Crown Attorney in this case advised me that it would be better if a deal was made. The deal? If Andrew Ozadash would plead guilty to assault, the charges of interception would be dropped. Andrew Ozadash was still holding out and refusing to plead guilty until the photos of my injuries were shared with him and his defense lawyer. When I still demanded a trial, the Crown Attorney said to me, "Look, you married him. You and him have got to figure out how to work together. You've got a son together." Like the judge in family court the previous year, this Crown Attorney never met my child. The police officers that night never met my child. The family lawyers never met my child. Yet they all seemed to know what was best for Jared and I. Of course, I actually had no say on whether there would be a trial or not, as it is the Crown's job to save the system money, and trials are costly. So Andrew Ozadash pled guilty to the assault. The judge took a couple of seconds to glance at my victim impact statement, and then sentenced him to 2 years probation, 72 hours of community service, which he actually served at his brother's girlfriend's agency, and a fine of $300 to be given to the local women's shelter. He was also ordered to attend the PARS program and to refrain from being in possession of any weapons or ammunition and not be within 500 feet of my person. When asked how many hours he worked by the judge, Andrew Ozadash replied, 60 to 70 hours weekly, mostly out of town, especially Quebec and the US. How different from his lies stating he was the primary caregiver of Jared in family court, who attended to his son's every need. He was now convicted, and naively again, I thought this would make a difference in his access with Jared. I was wrong. On September 12, 2003, 8 months after his conviction, he breached his probation. Andrew Ozadash, along with his mother, approached Jared and I outside the doctor's office, where Jared had been seen for a throat infection. Jared was very sick and begged me to stay with him. I called the Access Center to tell them of Jared's illness and to inform Mr. Ozadash that this weekend's access would be canceled. This was the first time I had ever canceled a visit. I had always been told that if I had refused him access, police would arrive at my home and take Jared physically and put him in the police car. This went on for about 10 minutes. I was terrified that he was going to kidnap Jared. He was sticking his head through the half-open window, saying, "Don't you want to be with Daddy, Jared? Don't you want to be with Daddy?" And poor Jared, who's eyes were glazed over and so sick, and begged me to be with him that weekend. Said, "I'm really sick, Daddy. I just want to be with Mommy." Andrew Osadash and his mother finally left. When he did leave, that was when I finally realized that he had parked right beside my own car. When I got home, shaking and terrified, I called the police, and as my mother watched over Jared, I spoke with a female officer. I described the assault he was convicted of and showed her his arrest documents. She advised me that he would be arrested. Later that evening, I met with the same officer where I described my concerns for Jared and I. In her notes, she states that there is a long history of domestic violence with Mr. Osadash, and that Julie Osadash appears very shaken and frightened. She wrote how I stated that I wasn't sure if I was relieved he had been arrested, as I knew he would snap again, or that when he gets out, he will become bolder, as he is very revengeful. She also writes, Julie Osadash is holding her hands over her eyes as she fears leaving a gas can out after mowing the lawn, thinking of what he might do. CAS was contacted, and I was told they would be contacting me. I felt relieved. CAS are here to protect children, right? They will help Jared and I. How wrong I was. I had also had contacts with the women's shelter in Brantford. They had written me stating that Andrew Osadash would be attending the PARS program, and I was on a waiting list for counseling. During the same time he attended this program, I was seeing counselors at this shelter describing how I couldn't believe such a violent, controlling man could be allowed to be unsupervised with Jared. The counselor was given a detailed history of the abuse and how I believed Mr. Osadash was a sociopath and a control freak, a ticking time bomb. I was told to write everything down. I kept a journal that nobody wanted to look at. As I was listened to, consoled, passed the Kleenex, and again, nothing changed. No information was shared with the facilitators of the PARS program by my counselor. I have seen the notes taken by the counselors there, and all his actions, his abuse, his wiretapping, his control are all written down. Why? Why bother to write notes when no help is given? In one note, a counselor I had spoken to over the phone for over an hour basically repeats what the other counselor wrote, except at the end of it she writes, "Caller did not sound emotionally convincing." This was seen by me months after my son's murder. You can imagine how angry I was. After his conviction in January 2003, I spoke with his probation officer numerous times. I trusted this man, who I learned after my son's death was the domestic violence expert in Brantford's probation services. In his notes, which I saw in 2009, he writes, Julie Osadash, still fearful of Andrew Osadash, says he is a sociopath and a control freak. Not concerned for her safety at this time. When I found hundreds of .22 caliber bullets and an illegal gun clip in the laundry room hidden behind some boxes in February 2003, just 1 month after his conviction, this officer was the first person I called. He advised me to take the articles to the police station, which I did. After my son was killed, I asked for the inventory of these items, and written there was, "Women came into station feeling uncomfortable about ammunition in her home." There was no follow-up after I advised officers of his conviction and that I believed he had a gun, despite their assurances that they would look into it. This information was never shared with anyone, and they even have the wrong names on the forms. This probation officer never followed up on my finding the ammunition and the illegal gun clip. He also never met my Jared. My path with victim services. Soon after my first meeting with the volunteers at Victim Services in Brantford, I met with a supervisor, and again I told my story and described my fears for Jared. I was given the handout, the refrigerator door, equipped with a support link phone for calling 911, and given a safety plan. This plan gave me tips on how to keep not just myself safe, but my child. I find it so hypocritical that while Jared was with his mother, myself, during the week, he was in danger from this violent man. Yet every weekend, when Jared was unsupervised with this same man, he was safe? Victim Services were aware that Jared was in his father's care every weekend. No one at Victim Services ever met my child. My path with CAS. I first met with a CAS worker just a week after the assault in April 2002. She spoke to me for about half an hour, thought everything was fine, and left. She was supposed to have followed up with a meeting with Andrew Ozadash. She never did. Then in September 2003, when he breached his probation and was arrested again, CAS contacted me. I met a young worker who looked no older than 21, and she would be looking after Jared's case. She had the notes from the female police officer who had been so concerned for my safety, also notes from a sergeant who advised no bail for Andrew Ozadash. In her first notes, she writes, "Julie says she is afraid Jared will fall through the cracks and he will come to harm." I had spoken thoroughly with her about the abuse. I agreed to workers from CAS seeing Jared in school without my presence. Here's some advice for any parent. Never, ever let someone interview your child without your presence. Strangers do not know your child. They can take things out of context or jump to conclusions. A few days after they interviewed Jared for about 5 minutes, I went to see this caseworker along with her supervisor. I had recently found out the password to the remaining computer in my home, and with a friend's help, had opened up files of Andrew Ozadash. Extreme pornography, including scenes with what appeared underage girls. And the most disturbing was a 10-second, non-sexual snuff film where a man standing in a field with his back to some trees has his throat cut from behind. I'm no expert, but I believe it was a real film of a man being killed. I came prepared with the phone tapes from the wiretapping and the violent pornography from his computer. When I sat down, the two workers immediately told me, while they had their arms folded, that I had been emotionally abusing my son. Jared said that Daddy beat Mommy up. I must be coaching him. I could not believe what I was hearing. I told them that Jared's father was very manipulative and it was he who discussed the assault with Jared, not me. I then reminded them of his violence against me. They told me that over a year had gone by and I shouldn't be concerned anymore. In their notes, they criticized me for still being afraid of Andrew Ozadash. He did that to you, not Jared. When I asked them to view the pornography found on his computer, the supervisor threw the disc on the coffee table and said, "Every man's allowed to have his pornography. What do you think we're here for? To help you with your weekends?" No matter how much I defended myself and denied discussing the abuse with Jared, the more they criticized me. I was crying, which they criticized me for in their notes. The case was open for 3 weeks. Their whole aim was to make sure that Andrew Ozadash regained access with Jared. The only way this was possible was to close the case, as the Access Center refused to accept any child involved with CAS. So a very young woman, fresh out of school, on her first case as a CAS worker, with no real-life experiences, and certainly no understanding of domestic violence, refused to help my child. The system again failed my son. So now you see Jared's path with services. Many agencies and individuals had a chance to help him, but they all worked in silos. No agency shared information with another. The left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. After my son's murder, it was found Andrew Ozadash had at least 15 risk factors, not just for reoffending, but for lethality. The only person who knew he was dangerous was his victim, myself. I always knew he would try to kill me again one day. That is why, even though he was in a live-in relationship with someone, I would not date anyone. My instincts told me that I would always be his property and Jared his trophy. This is why I was determined to continue to use the Access Center for exchange, so he would never be able to drop Jared off at my home and work his way into the home. Because I knew he would be violent again and Jared would be harmed too. Well, Jared was murdered during a fight between his father and his partner. And when his father became violent and picked up knives and started attacking his girlfriend and her daughter, Jared came running down and tried to save them and lost his own life. There is no better risk assessor than a victim. If she fears for herself, and especially her children, please, please listen to her. Please share information, become proactive. Learn all you can about the dynamics involved with domestic violence, and when there is an abuser and his victim, this is not adult conflict, but a serious crime, and if a mother is not safe, her children are not safe. You know, when I spoke of the night of my assault in April of 2002, I mentioned the officer who spoke with Andrew Ozadash in the basement, and then who drove him to the station to book him. He did not meet my Jared that night. No. He met him on March 18, 2006, at the townhouse when he came upon my son's lifeless, bloody body with his eyes staring open on the first landing. He also escorted my son's body to the morgue and then turned the key when my beautiful little boy, once so full of life, was placed in a cold drawer to await his autopsy. And then he was locked in. Another important figure was my second family lawyer, who could never understand why I still insisted 3 years later on using the Access Center and pushed for mediation and never a trial. As I was standing beside my little boy's coffin at his viewing, still trying to protect him as he wore his drum court uniform for the first and last time, this lawyer approached me. I couldn't help myself. Before he could get a word in, I just looked at him and said, "Do you believe me now? Do you believe me now?" He walked away. My father told me later that he came up to him and said, "You know, John, Julie was right. She was right all along. I'm so sorry. But God, I wish I had been wrong." Here is a poem by my son at age 6. There is a hardness in the things we can't do, but at least we have a heart in us that is special. That's what's important about us. There's lots of things we can't do, like we can't breathe underwater and we can't breathe underground. Birds can fly and we can't. Just call it the hardness. But the important thing about us is that we have a heart. Thank you.
Julie, on behalf of all of us, thank you for your courage. Thank you for sharing your pain and everything that you have had to live through, not once, but over and over again through the inquest and through telling the terrible story of everything that you had to suffer and Jared had to suffer. I think everybody here needs to be reminded, the same way your lawyer was reminded after the fact, that sometimes people are right. Sometimes when victims tell us about their instincts, that we have to be able to trust them, that they know what they're dealing with. And as you said, that not only trust them, but also make sure that we're working together and not working in silos. On behalf of everyone here, not only do I want to thank you, but we've taken some of the funds from the conference registration and we've used them to pull together a sizable donation to Jared's Place to encourage you to continue your important work and continue to speak out. We all need to hear your voice. Thanks for being here.